right. This is the Therapy podcast. I'm Joel Blackstock, and I'm here with a man that truly needs no introduction. A philosopher king, rock star, a published author, world traveler, collector of rare artifacts, esoteric magic specialist now. So Samuel Blanchette, am I saying that right? Is another social worker who reached out to me, and we're both kind of in a similar world, and a ton of the stuff that I've done, I think it's just because our website is a little bit more visible. As people see ideas and they're kind of looking for people in their world. We've talked a little bit about how academic psychology is going in a different direction than clinical practice, because the market is wanting things that are not happening in the hospitals by and large, which is not a great place for the profession to be in. And so anyway, I have a lot of these conversations like on the phone with people that want to connect, and like they're fun and they're interesting, and I learned a bunch of stuff. And so decided I'm just going to start doing that on the podcast. One, because I'm out of time. All I do is therapy, podcast, and play with my kids and sleep. And so Sam was a really interesting, nice guy who reached out and wanted to connect, and I'm sure we'll have a fascinating conversation. So thank you so much for being here. Can you introduce your actual biography?
Yeah, so aside from my arcanium of esoteric skills and my treasure seeking and so forth,
I should have come up with more like more like antiquated titles like alienist, things like
sure.
That.
Right.
Haberdasher, farrier.
all of those things in the progression of learning how to be a human, right? Yeah. Yes, I'm a random human being that reached out to you because I saw that you had found a really kind of lovely way of integrating some of the modern neurological approaches with some of the cool more philosophical approaches. I don't think there's really a distinction there, but just to make discrimination between, as if we could do that to ourselves.
Semantic distinction only, really.
Yes. And so I am a master's level clinician with licensed associate clinician. So I'm working towards my ultimate end goal of whatever that is.
What are your stages here? Because here the C is the terminal license.
Interesting. Yeah. So I'm in Arizona, so that, and it is different across all the states. And my degree is actually in counseling, so I'm not coming from the social working realm.
Okay. When you said LCS, because here it's ALC, LPC, and then social is counselor, and then social worker is LGSW, which they just changed to LMSW. And then it turns into LICSW, which used to be LCSW. And our board, in its infinite wisdom, moves some letters around.
Absolutely. I really appreciate some of the states, though, that are working on doing kind of interstate compacts as far as that goes. I think that's kind of a really cool...
The counselors are so much better at it than the social workers. And it's like, and I think there's pros and cons to both ones, but overall, it seems like the social workers have like a little bit less self-esteem or something. Like, I don't know what it is. And the boards seem like during the pandemic, the counseling boards are like getting together, and the clinical psychology boards are making everything, APAs, like making everything like so much easier for the licensed to practice across state lines and meet this need in a mental health crisis. And like our board is making it harder and being like, actually, there's these hoops because we have to make extra sure. Which, I mean, there's maybe ways to do it, but it's just like they keep raising the number of ethics hours because they're like, well, people keep sleeping with their patients, so maybe that they're doing that because they haven't heard it for 8 hours instead of 4. And it's like, no, like that. I don't think no one told them not to do it is the problem. I think
right. Like pretty much like introduction to you want to be a mental health professional.
They're going to be so bored that we are going to kill the libido of the entire profession. No, I mean, it's like you need to kind of catch that, and the education level and the support level and the licensure level, which for some reason we'll just tack on these CEs and then that'll fix these problems retroactively, which is supposed to be the system's profession. Social workers are supposed to understand the system as it actually works, not as we wish it did. The stereotype is the LPC is kind of in a vacuum being like symptomology, which isn't always true. And the social worker is more like person and environment, food, racism, culture, but for some reason those are not the ones that make the laws about social work.
Yeah, and I think that's, that's an interesting point that you make about coming into this field, right? And I think to some degree, well, it seems that human beings have an interest in how their minds, psyches, souls work, right? How this thing functions. Because we all experience suffering, and so we try to create methods of managing whatever that is, right?
Mhm.
And I think that that's such an interesting point about this, like creating education of so many hours to try and inform you of information. And there's such a huge difference between the experience of sitting with somebody in an intensely emotional space and the theoretical constructs around sitting with somebody in emotional space.
Mhm. And everybody who doesn't do that seems to want to tell you how to, the psychiatrist that has never been in therapy and doesn't practice therapy, and the
Right. And
head of the insurance board and the state legislature have all these opinions about things they don't do, like teach children or do counseling.
yes, all of those pieces. And I think, I mean, you used a really, I mean, explicit example, right? This idea of like, oh, they keep on like engaging in relationships with these, people that it's outside of the framework and the boundaries of the holding container, right? And
Mhm.
at the same time, if you don't know how to work with the energy of human connection, right? Like
Mhm.
the intensity of that on the levels that are necessary to some degree to like,
Mhm.
be a
And for
human.
multiple types of people, you kind of got to be a chameleon. You need to be what they need, not what want.
Absolutely. And to stay with that is interesting. And I think that's a huge part of what our field does. We create mental constructs in order to feel safe when we're journeying into the unknown. And I think, brain spotting, I think that the author makes a really interesting point about like this quadrillion connections in the human brain.
Mhm.
And I think that that's lovely to be aware of because I think one thing I've noticed as a struggle is they boards and other trends try to dictate what is the right way of
Mhm.
doing therapy. And oh boy, I've had so many internal conflicts or like
Well, you can do the right thing for the wrong reasons or the wrong thing for the right reasons. It's
Mhm.
like there's some people who use exercise as an avoidance. So if they're
Sure.
processing trauma with brain spotting, stop exercising. It's not that that's a bad thing to do, but it's
Mhm.
like, so a lot of times I think when you put more control at the top level, you're just making providers sort of have a different aesthetic about doing what they're doing anyway. It doesn't actually
Mm.
change practice that much.
Yeah, I
If
think
anything, it makes it worse. Yeah.
yeah, this idea of having to change the language that you express the thing that you're going to be doing naturally anyway.
Well, and like the whole profession, I mean, I think that's like why mental health is such a weird spot. Is it's like, because you see it if you're a social worker and you're working with like grants and things,
Yes.
but there's all these assumptions baked in to the way the rules are written, that
Mhm.
there's services that exist and connections and things that have not been around for 30 years. So like
Mm.
half of it is ticking boxes that are fake just because it used to work this certain way. And like it's not quite a catch 22, but we need a word for that. I mean, and one of the things is it's like psychiatrists know how to do therapy. It's just this assumption because
Oh,
psychiatrists
sure.
know how to read research about CBT. And it's like, no, we used to think that because it used to be true because they used to do therapy and they used to be in therapy. And now
Mhm.
the vast majority of them are not. But for
Mm.
some reason, they're the one that calls me, from an insurance panel that I'm no longer in that says, well, you should be able to treat dissociative identity disorder in 3 sessions with CBT, or drugs are mandated and no more therapy will be paid for. And also brain spotting isn't evidence-based, and neither is EMDR, and neither is like, some other long list of stuff she wanted me to. It
Mhm.
was like, hey, have you ever done this? Like, I mean, I asked, it'd be that they like
Oh,
they like I left
excellent.
the panel and then they were like, well, fine. And now they call me every year and ask me to go back in. I never will, but they're like,
Hmm.
um, like, I don't know. Was it your dream to be the member of a 15-person, fake referral insurance thing that's local to this zip code? Like, what are you doing? Why are you telling me how to do therapy? You've never done it. Like,
Mm.
and
Mm.
I don't know.
Oh yeah, that divide is a curious one because in some cases it actually like bears really pleasant fruit, right? Like some of the really cool neurological studies and some of the like neuropsych stuff. Um, what I really love about it, in all honesty, is it gives credence to a lot of historical and traditional methods of working with people, and now we can just label it with scientific terms and say it's good. An example
Mhm.
that I really like, so memory reconsolidation, I think is so lovely. That's really been encouraging to me, this idea that there is a way that the brain changes things fundamentally, permanently, emotionally, right? Love that. It's very encouraging to me. And in my process of doing therapy, I deeply fell in love with Gestalt therapy at the very beginning of things. I had found the book Ego, Hunger, and Aggression, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I really love the depth of this thing.
Fritz Perls, he was an interesting guy.
Yeah, he was. I think a lot of, we have videos and we use that to interpret a certain total system and philosophical approach, which it is what it is, and that's what people do. But his wife, Laura Pearls, contributed so much. Goodman, all these different thinkers contributed to this really, really lovely existential approach to therapy.
I think its downfall was kind of two things too. It was like, one, he was kind of a little bit more of a showman. He was probably kind of like me. Like it was like, I want to show you how well this thing works by demonstrating it. And so people thought it was too reductive. No, not reductive. They thought it was like too much of like a, I don't know, just some kind of a trite technique or something. Instead of, he was showing them part of a system. And then also like East and West Coast Gestalt kind of got in a fight. I mean, it's like the middle of California. People were like, this should be therapy, and the other people are like, it should be religion, which I guess your therapy modality is successful if it accidentally forms like a religion / cult. I don't know,
like a philosophical life approach. I think you're absolutely right though about that thing, and I think the challenge that happens, the unfortunate thing is like when certain people take things to their extreme. Especially when part of the whole thing is trying to keep ideas alive to some degree. Like you said, let me show you something cool, right? And I think what that winds up doing though is like, especially in the case of like Gestalt therapy, like here's this like beautiful a theoretical idea, right? Field theory, dialogical approach, I and thou, phenomenology. Relationship, the in-between, bracketing, all these brilliant, really lovely existential concepts kind of like flowing into this approach. And then we wind up with like, oh yeah, I do empty chair work, therefore I'm using it. And it's like, it's like saying like all Jungian therapy is active imagination, right? Like it's like, let's take a technique.
We don't even give Jungian therapy, I mean, actual Jungians that are trained, it's like a ton of the time. They just, especially, I think it's more of an American Jungian thing where they just sanitize it so much, and they're like, oh, it's just therapy plus Jesus, or it's like therapy you can bring to church, or it's like a sand tray or something. Like, but there's not. I mean, it happens with all modalities. Same thing you're talking about. It's like people mistake the technique for the lens of the modality, which is how you're understanding a person, which is how the conceptualization is so much more important than what you're doing in the room.
Oh, I agree so fully. I think, and the hard part is like, how do you describe being a human, right? Like, it's so potentially nuanced.
The problem is psychology there,
Yeah, and then how do we turn this into something that creates transformative change? And I think, again, like, out of all the things that sort of Jungian / Jung's love of alchemical ideas and that framework of thought, I think it's so beautiful because it's at least language that's not dependent on time, right? So whether it's the Taoists or Ayurvedic traditions or these different things, they're all drawing from this concept of transformation. And now my experience, especially when we're looking at things like parts work and stuff, everybody's labeled these things in their own way with their own conceptual lens.
So much of the especially like IFS is like him just putting which I don't dislike IFS. Like if I had a giant treatment center and I needed to train everybody to be able to do the best work with it, but he put Jungian archetypes together with Gestalt therapy's experiential component. And maybe some DBT skills, but like that's what it is, and the language of it is kind of dogmatic, I think it's like so much easier to just say protective part. You kind of feel how this one's a physical protective part, that one's kind of an unconscious one or whatever, than getting in a fight with a client about if something's like a firefighter or a protector or what. Like personally, like, I mean, it's people who do great work, but I'm not as wild about the language of all that.
And
Also, they
then,
think it's family therapy. Every time you say IFS, people think you're a family therapist.
sure. And they're like, what, do I have to bring my mother in? Well,
Yeah.
the mother that lives in you, whether that's, an
She's
object
already
formation,
here. Yeah.
she's in the space, part of your phenomenological field. Look how we're doing this.
So
Uh,
what did you work with Gestalt, but what are the kind of broad strokes of your practice now, or the stuff that you
so, I'm not an official anything, right? Because unfortunately, there's a pace wall that inhibits people from becoming certified in anything, and I understand that to some degree because people want purity of systems, possibly, or they don't want to be misrepresented, or whatever that means, and that's okay, and I understand that. I think unfortunately that again diminishes the free exchange of information and ideas, and then you wind up with, like you said, these dogmas that have to approach existence in a very fixed pattern, and
Mhm.
that's neurotic traditionally. Anyway,
Yeah.
but so I would say my current I would say the collection of things, right? So I do really like, primarily because it makes me feel confident, and science is important to people and myself, right? So this sort of neurobiological piece, especially polyvagal theory, I really like that. And again, all of those are still constructs built on our current understanding of medicine and biology, but I really like polyvagal theory. I like I said, memory reconsolidation. I like the
Mhm.
idea that there are fundamental processes that mammals use to make adaptation, and that just makes sense to me. Um, and then sort of more of that, the Gestalt oriented humanistic type of thing. So kind of like
Mhm.
sort of Maslowy kind of existential stuff. And then I did a real deep dive into like parts work and things, because if you've ever sat with anyone, whether you're a therapist or otherwise, there is a transition of consciousness between aspects of themselves, however you want to define that, right?
Mhm.
And people have been exploring that from the beginning of time. In fact, like eye movement and all of these things have been deeply analyzed by like Taoists and in ancient Arabia, and like all these different kinds of things. People have been playing with human observation and how we do what we do. But one thing that constantly shows up, and I met it first in Gestalt work, right? Doing empty chair. It's like, oh my gosh, what is this? We have two fundamentally different states of consciousness, and I use consciousness to define the whole being, right? It's not a thought process, but it's a total representation of self in the world, right? With environment. And it's just so fascinating there. And I really, really fell in love with that and started like strongly believing in it in a sense. However, that's an interesting space to go because it's very unknown, right? Like, and so I was looking for framework to understand this. And I first like got some deep framework in psychosynthesis, right? Assagioli really going into all these details about subpersonalities and the alchemical process of, transmutation of self. And then I started kind of playing around from there. And it's interesting to see now what my work kind of shows up as, after I've been exposed to all these different methods, voice dialogue,
Mhm.
internal family systems, all these different ones. There's a gentleman,
Well,
John
does
Rose.
voice dialogue have like purchase out there? I mean, it seems like there's not a ton of places still doing it much.
So I had to look to find all of these things, right?
Mhm.
Ego states is super fun, enjoyable for folks because it, derives from a currently utilized processes that are popular.
That's like the last remnant of transactional analysis that's still out there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, like this, which all have roots in this Gestalt thing, which all have roots in,
Mhm.
psychoanalytic processes, right? Ego and superego are parts, right? I mean,
Mhm.
define them how you will. They're something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think finding out how to work with parts, and also my own process has looked like working with parts and also realizing more of this kind of, again, this field oriented idea, or kind of this Buddhist idea of this non-local non-duality. So it's like parts and no parts can both mutually exist, and what's meaningful is how it applies in the field of exchange in that moment with the person. At least that's kind of where I'm sitting at. I'm kind of wondering for yourself, how have you integrated that? Do you stick kind of like sharply to a process of the way of working with parts, or how have you integrated this? Because you have a lot of really cool neurobiological techniques, right? And then you have this other stuff too. I'm very curious about that.
Well, I mean, I think probably what you're responding to is when I'm looking at the way that a lot of these models are written,
Mm,
Jung or Pearls or whatever.
mm.
I mean, they're written in phenomenological language. It's like this is
Yeah.
just how this feels.
Yes.
And so they're kind of intuitive, which is the reason why a lot of people, they won't die. A lot of people are called back to them, and a lot
Mm.
of reasons why they're never going to be institutionally
Funded.
is that they're not, it's not an objective thing. It's kind of an intuitive concept about, don't you understand this part of your own experience?
Mhm.
If you're chasing the academic thing and you don't understand that part of your experience, that's not going to speak to you, because
Yes.
it's not real. You can't see it, taste it, touch it. This is about a subjective kind of felt state
Yes.
in the parts of self that you can feel and work with. And I mean, frankly, I think to do certain kinds of trauma therapy, you have to carry a certain amount of trauma that you've worked through,
Yeah. Well,
or
yeah.
else you don't really
You understand
understand
what
it.
kind of thing.
Yeah, and but then now there's neurology and neurobiology that is able to explain, or we can make guesses.
Mm.
I'll still get like a nasty email from a clinical psychology student, but like we can make guesses about what these parts of the brain do, and that's
Right.
always been my interest. And so it's like, because I was always frustrated with just how bad academia is at admitting that it's wrong. Like it's the same people publishing these papers that are like, Jung doesn't, the unconscious isn't real, and this is whatever. And now,
Behaviorism and it's like
yeah, now
parts.
trauma is trendy. So the same guy's like writing a paper that's like, well, there's tertiary, secondary, and primary levels of consciousness, but the tertiary levels are only, symbolic function and show up in the body. And you're like, what, dude? Like, you're wrong. Just write, I'm sorry. That's the paper that you should be publishing. But you're just, so my thing is going back and saying, look, yeah, these philosophies are perennial, meaning they pop up independently because there's people sort of feeling themselves and discovering the same thing about how we work.
Yeah.
But then a lot of times, I don't really have a friend anywhere because I'm saying, no, I'm not just in this club. I'm trying to say that all these clubs share functions and that neither one of them is, they all have pros and cons. They all have drawbacks.
Yes.
People don't like that. They like me for the extent of me saying, well, this is what you're doing is interesting, and here's a cool way to articulate it, and here's some techniques there. They like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I say, okay, but here's where the limitations are and where you can pivot if, oh no, don't do that. And that's the, people kind of like the stuff online until they don't. I won't even get a chance to respond to the emails sometimes. It's just like, oh, this is great and I used it, and this is great and I used it. Oh wait, you said this thing that's threatening to the way that I practice, so I don't think you understand. Like, oh, I haven't said anything yet. Like, I don't know. I don't know if that answers it, but that video that I have where I'm talking about like how I think the breakdown of these models is like how experiential they are and how cognitive they are. And so the person who comes in and says that they want existential therapy, and they're like, I did my PhD in Sartre, and you said existential therapy, and I'm called to whatever. I'm like, in the back of my head, I'm like, that's the last thing that you need,
Well, right, because
it's not that other people are hell; it's that you are in hell because you feel bad. Like, and you don't need to, And the same thing with the person who comes in that's just totally in their feeling state, and their feelings all that's real, and they want to dump all this emotion. I mean, really, what you need is to kind of get outside of that and see a bigger picture and have some kind of spiritual or philosophical lens to analyze your life. Which Yalom says that in his book, that the kind of therapy you come in wanting is usually the last one that you need.
And it's that Jungian function of opposites, right? Or this
tension of opposites, yeah.
Yeah. It's like, okay, yeah, we want to come in this way. So it's likely that the other side of that is probably where we're going to get the most yield. However, how do we get you to feel comfortable walking into that space? Because we have to build structure and some different scaffolding to step into the unknown, right? So if I am like loaded with a certain perspective, it's easy for me to walk in that world until I dip my toe in the reality that I don't perceive. Then it's like, oh my goodness. And then we get all of the functions of like adaptation, like, oh, that threatens my self-concept and all this loveliness.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's, if you just listen to conflict or politics or, whatever, it's like half of the fights that people get into or where they become the most reactive is just where somebody's saying, hey, my behavior doesn't line up with my self-image, and you're pointing that out to me. Which is like one of the reasons why I can do therapy, but probably not anything else very well, is that I don't quit doing that ever. If you say something, I'm going to take it at face value. And because of that, people come into therapy, there's kind of a buy-in to that process of like, but it makes you a miserable, person to be around at Thanksgiving.
Mhm. Oh,
maybe
sure.
we'll drop this episode then. But like
Right.
when I was in a hospital, like I couldn't turn it off. I mean, they would have this thing where they're like, "Hey, we really want to continuously improve, and we want to know what the problem is, and we want your all input, and we want you to be honest." And then I'd be like, "Okay, well then here's a thing that you could do easily that would save you money, and it would reduce burnout, and it would reduce errors, and the downside is it might threaten somebody's ego, or we would just have to admit that there's a problem," which is what you're asking. Oh, no, don't say that. That's not what you're supposed to. Okay, fine. Then you don't want what you said, so don't do this meeting. Like, give me 3 hours of my life every 6 months, or say, I want you to give me your honest feedback where it's you know what I mean? Like, it's like, as long as you're saying it, I'm going to continue to take it at face value, even though I know you don't mean what you're saying. And I'm not
Yeah.
going to stop doing that. I mean, that's the hill that I'm going to die on.
And that's the phenomenological approach, right?
Yeah.
Like you literally cannot know anything other than what is happening in the immediate now, right? It's like everything else is extrapolation or some sort of like projection or something. So it's like, okay, this is what you mean, right? And they're like, no. Okay, so this is not what you mean, but this is what you're saying. Is that correct? and I love that. I love that this memory reconsolidation, like the fundamental initial tenet, is just creating this explicit awareness and then a juxtaposition of like, so this and this, yes.
Can you
And
talk
that's
a little bit about memory reconsolidation for people that may not be familiar, the technique there? And
yeah,
the
absolutely.
assumptions?
Let's see. So Ecker, Bruce Ecker, Lauren Holey. So Bruce Ecker was a physicist before he started getting into the whole therapy situation. And, I love that people have passions, because passions create, like, they take people down wormholes that lead to information I would never find because my passion doesn't lean in that direction. And so they really did a lot of work looking at this idea of how we fundamentally change our memories, right? There was this idea up until like the early 2000s or so that once it's in long-term memory storage, you're stuck with it, right? And even we have in Van der Kolk's book, like the body keeps the score. It's like, no, once it's in there, you're stuck. and then that leads, right? That necessitates creating processes where we're doing a counter development of a strategy, right? So we're looking for extinction, which is like, let me build up this neurological pathway that's contrary to this one so they can battle it out. And hopefully my prefrontal cortex wins out against my limbic system and my subcortical areas when I'm threatened. And we can do that through some desensitization and building up strategies, right? Which is fine. And that also, building strategies is how we learn, grow, and develop. However, the fundamental sense of emotional pain when I access a historical piece of my existence, that's not very fun. And that's what drives most of us to seek change. Right? And this idea is really lovely because they were going off this model, like you can't erase long-term memory. Once it's in, it's in. And then, whoa, all sorts of cool experiments. They're using mice, and then they're putting in certain chemicals that inhibit the consolidation of certain kinds of neurological processes, and bada boom, bada bang. Now we're not having the long-term memory affect them on an emotional level, but they still theoretically hold on to that information in a chronological fashion, right?
Yeah,
So
and anything like with brain science, because there are billions of connections, is going to be reduced to some kind of metaphor. I mean, there's no way to talk about it without being reductive unless you're a supercomputer.
yeah.
But I mean, that's another thing. A lot of the research is showing is the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system are out of sync. They're not acting in the same way. Which, I mean, to me, with brain spotting and ETT and a lot of the pupil dilation stuff that we do, you can't fake those reactions. When your pupil's like doing this, you're having a brain bleed, or you're maybe brain spotting works and it's doing something that's neurologically reproducible with a reproducible effect, even if it's not past a zillion randomized controlled trials and isn't 30 years old yet. There's something I can recreate in the room. I hear the same thing from the patient. It cures the same thing. That's how science works. Even it starts here. You research it later, and there are a lot of studies on it now being more effective than EMDR and some other things. But the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system fighting each other. One dilates the eye; it has kind of a sphincter-like muscle that tightens, and the other one has a pulling muscle that opens the eye. Sorry, I hit my mic. And that when you usually don't drive with your foot on the gas and the brake,
Right. Yeah.
but what I can do is hit those to be intention, with color, light, frequency, eye
Mhm.
position, all the different techniques that we have now, eye movement sometimes, until they resync and my body is assuming the same thing that the front of my brain is assuming about how the world works, not something that is 15 years old, traumatic
Mhm.
event.
I love that, and this even speaks to like Peter Levine, the oscillation
Yeah, yeah.
between felt senses, right? Even going back to earlier stuff of self-observation, we're looking at like Eugene Gendlin in this focusing, right? Like here's a felt sense, I experience it, I put words on it, and then there's this curious thing. Speaking back to this memory reconsolidation piece, which I love because it's non-theoretical, right? It is theoretical in the scientific sense, but it's trans-theoretical in the sense that it doesn't belong to anybody. Nobody can,
Yeah.
like they say, like, oh, this is my method.
You can't reconsolidate memory. Only I can do that.
Right, like I have it all. It's mine. Pay me thousands of dollars to learn my strategy, which is fine.
Yeah,
And
that is kind of, even the models that I like, it's kind of off-putting where they're like, well, if you use this word, then you're, whatever. It's like, man, come on. Like, why are you doing this? Like,
well, we have to on some, because it's marking territory and it's validating philosophical processes and trying to differentiate that from something else and all the things. So what I love though, and I'm very curious, especially with brain spotting and various other eye movement type things, whether that's NLP and the different ways of accessing or looking in the visual field or any of these things, or even just staying with the micro tremors and neurogenic tremoring that happens during certain kinds of activation, all the good stuff, right?
mm-hmm.
The lovely thing about this this idea, so the concept here for the memory reconsolidation is that it is theoretically the way. So not, and sometimes that feels kind of powerful, but it is the way of creating forever emotional change. And the way that it works is memory is consolidated during event of high emotion, right? So boom, I have stored that in my system. However we do that, we have no clue, right? We have all these ideas on how memory works, but it's way too integrative to just be reduced to like neurons. It's yeah. So memory is stored with emotion, right? In order to change that, and the process is really, really simple, but it's also challenging because the process is this. I need to activate that as a felt experience, that memory with the emotional component. Once I activate that memory in a felt experience, I need to create an explicit juxtaposition is the word that they use. Something that fundamentally on a felt sense disconfirms the fact that that is. Whatever that might be, whether that's I'm using an eye thing and I'm in a safe space or whatever that is. And what that does is it unlocks all of the patterns of how that's held, because now, just like an animal, right, I have an explicit fact that contradicts the emotional content. And once that opens, then we have a process of 5-hour window where if we continually repeat the disconfirming event, when it reconsolidates, the evidence says that what should happen is that should no longer elicit anything. You can call it back up and it will be a historical piece of information, but it will not be emotional charge to it.
It sounds like lifespan integration is doing that too. I'm not trained in that one. I've read the book, and one of my supervision candidates is really into it. But it sounds similar in that you're kind of taking these things that are felt, experiential, pretty strong, activating memories, but they are contradictory, and then ramming them all through so quickly that you can't continue to have all of that stored somatic memory be unchallenged, and then the brain kind of lets it go.
Yeah, and the timeline and lifespan stuff is really interesting because if we look at NLP, they've been using timelines and things for a long time, right? And this is one of the other things that I struggle with is people will take ideas that are explicitly described in older therapeutic modalities. They will not give credit to the line of thinking, and they will attribute it to their own process. That is one of the things.
Well, and then sometimes they don't even know when they're doing it. I mean, you can kind of tell when people know that they're doing it and when people don't. Like Joseph Campbell bringing Jung to America. I mean, I feel like he knew what he was stealing, and he intentionally didn't, give. He was a Jungian, and he didn't give credit to it. He said that, but there's other people where I think they've just heard something and then they start doing something and then they decide they can. You know what I mean? Like
yeah, that's fair. What I really love though about this process, so this idea, memory, recall it somatically in a felt way, juxtaposition of experience, something that completely explicitly confronts that, creates the unlock, which then allows new information to be encoded and the memory to go away. And what's really kind of neat is though, this is very dependent on each situation. So you can remove the emotional charge of a certain thing, but if it has other connections or other parts that are attached to it, each of those would also need to go through this process of memory reconsolidation in order to get the full effect of, when I think of that in this context, it no longer elicits that strong, necessary emotional survival response. And what I like about it is because it's kind of like just a concept neurologically, it means that every therapeutic modality could theoretically work. And if they worked, it means they followed this natural biological process. And if what I really love about concepts like that is that it gives a lot of freedom back to the clinician to trust their artfulness, their own
intuition.
Their intuition, yeah. So it says, okay, this is generally how it works. Even if polyvagal theory, I think, was also beautiful for that. This is generally how it works. Now, knowing that within the confines of the biology, let's use our creative, playful curiosity to generate new outcomes.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing that you can't teach. It's like, I love it if there's an interview candidate that fights with me. Because they understand something and they believe it and they know something. They're not just trying to figure out what somebody wants from them. Those are the clinicians that take years to get better, the ones that are coming from the hospital or something. And like, it's almost like they were trained not to think for themselves and justify everything that they do in this thing. And, like the question that you can't fake in an interview, if you're early in your therapy education, remember this one. Just absorb a ton of podcasts and a ton of like current material on that, and then go in with like a fresh perspective and be like, this is where I think it's headed, this is where it's not, because you can't fake that question. When we do like executive coaching and people are talking about hiring, like I always mention, like just ask them the last thing that they learned and independently that they applied to their job. If somebody's telling you about what they learned in college 20 years ago, don't hire them. If they're like, well, I kind of think this and I think this way, even if it's coding, it doesn't have to be therapy, because you can't teach curiosity.
No.
It's a pretty good indicator of one, self-awareness, a conscious relationship with intuition, and a drive to be better, which is what you want, which is what you want in the room,
And I like that phrase. He said, curiosity can't be taught. And that other thing, because it can't be taught, it means that it's a biological function. And this is that like ventral vagal thing. It's like, and everyone uses different languaging, higher self, maybe the self, or these things. But the neat thing is,
I think it can be healed. I'm not saying that some people are born with it and some people aren't. It's genetic. I'm saying that like your relationship to your trauma and your life and your sense of self, that is a really good indicator of whether or not those things are in a good place, because a ton of people, it's like a ton of people who, that's why EINFJ types are so dangerous. You get Jesus and you also get Hitler. Like, because your intuition is so strong in order to like see what people want to hear and then get them to, in their own language, to go somewhere, which can make you really capable as a therapist, but also as a co-leader. And a lot of those people who are doing some are grifters, but a lot of the people who are doing bad work, like, it's not that they're meaning to, it's that they're mistaking trauma for intuition because they come from the same part of the brain. And they're actually having this trauma response, but it feels like the spirit's in me and I'm giving the sermon. I don't know. And like the early days of charismatic Christianity in the Old West, it really was wild that it was just like, up in the mountains, everybody with a dopamine disorder they've got the calling. Now let's. People would scream and cry and see things and lay on the ground. And buttoned up Victorian society was like, this slaps, man. Like, this is the coolest thing. Like, and they were feeling something like,
profound.
But you want your intuition to be conscious is the point,
Yeah, I like that. And I think that like being able, and even speaking to that piece, right? The neat thing is that humans, when given a safe container and given permission to be appropriately expressive and to feel, especially with others, because we do all this really cool neurological connection, you know, this mirror neurons and the distribution of like emotional tension, whether that's electromagnetic through whatever that is, as we're doing all that fun stuff or whatever. But the neat thing is when we have a community of people that are coming together with and ideally with full intention and understanding of what they're doing, and then they create a space for exchange and support. Man, those are the most beautiful healing environments. The Temnos, right? This container.
Yeah. That was the title of Will Selman's book about the spirituality of urban planning. A guy, he was on our podcast earlier. He's a really nice guy. You may hit him. But Tenemos is the name.
And the thing, I think, the disempowering part of information, right? In some respects, I think like it is, theoretically it's neutered, right? It's just information and we have the freedom to connect with that. But another battle that I fought, one of my own like internal oppressors, or call it what you will, right? It's like trying to do things the right way, you know, and I've been in enough.
It reduces anxiety if there's a right way, you know, and
absolutely.
And therapy gets to a point where somebody's being like, no, I know that you don't know. I know it's up to me, but I'm worried that I'm doing me wrong, you know, and it is this thing that it's such a silly idea or a silly statement, but it's a real thing. And that we have this insecurity about if we're doing us right, you know. I mean, I had somebody one time that told me, okay, yeah, you're saying that if I get rid of this, then I'll sit down and I'll know exactly who I am and I'll be able to connect with people in a way that's good. But what if I do that and I don't like who that guy is? And I just started laughing. So it's like, what am I supposed to say? What if I like myself and the self that I am right now is repulsed by the self that it could be in the future if I hold my potential? It's like, but it's so human. It makes a ton of sense. It's not like that person. I'm not making fun of them. I'm just saying like we all do that, right?
Yes.
I just never heard it said.
It's like, well, I don't like that guy.
Yeah.
Well, I don't like the authentic me. And I think the challenge with all of these like structured ways of having to be or trying to get it right, and somebody saying I have the way and all of this stuff, you know, the things that I think get hamstrung by those things in particular are the power of our own impressive creativity, the beauty of our intuition. And then the other thing is this, and I think this is something that earlier Jung and some of the Gestaltists and folks, the aesthetic value of beauty and felt sense, like congruence with beauty. Like, I don't think there's any objective way of measuring what feels congruent, right, good, and beautiful. So
that's architecture. We read a lot about architecture and have talked to a couple. I'm supposed to be on the Australian Institute of Architecture's podcast a little bit later on. But that's one of the things is it's like, it's an archetypal thing. And not a lot of people apply Jung's theories visually. I mean, some artists sort of did that in the 70s. And he generally did not like that art because he thought there was supposed to be a descent and then a return. You weren't just supposed to be enamored with the unconscious and become a psychonaut. Right, you were supposed to dissolve your ego and then come back and have learned something from it and have been transformed, but also go back to being how you were, you know, but a better version of that.
Journey piece.
But yeah, architecture is getting in touch, or filmmaking, you know, so many of those things. I mean, that's what you're saying is it's finding the beautiful isn't just I came up with it. It's almost like, you know, intuition is like a radio wave that you tune into and channel this thing or you don't. I mean, and you can say that you could use spiritual language about that, or you could use secular language of just this kind of deep genetic programming that we're getting in touch with, but only you can run your experiment to the end. You know, your choice is, do you do that or do you fail to? Or do you ignore it?
Yeah, and that's again that call to adventure. I like that kind of languaging around this thing, and I think there's a beautiful book by Piero Ferrucci, I guess is his name, and he's a psychosynthesist, right? And he
what is that? I'm not familiar with them.
Psychosynthesis. Yeah, so psychosynthesis was near the end time of Freud's process. Assagioli was a psychoanalyst. And he worked closely with Jung as well down in Italy. And he created a beautiful, beautiful model. He was informed by Theosophy, which is a really cool amalgam of a lot of different spiritual concepts. Blavatsky and these types of folks brought all that in. And
yeah, a lot of those flying around Vienna around that point.
Yeah. And yeah, during that time period, right, there's a lot
If
of this really.
Freud is kind of more of an inevitability than we give him credit for. I mean, there's other people, or they're not given credit for than we. I think we give him too much credit. It's kind of like Columbus. Like you have enough ships going around there, somebody's going to bump into it and realize you can't sail to India. If his ship sinks, somebody else does it. When you look at what's going on in Vienna with like Klempt, everybody, like people were going to apply this idea that maybe we are not only what we think, maybe there's forces beneath the surface to medicine, to psychology, and they probably would have done it a little bit better than Freud, the random guy, or
Right. Well,
gentler.
and unfortunately, like, he had to create a modality that he could sell to a community which believed in the world in a certain kind of way, But some of the earlier ideas and even the archetypical imagery that comes in, this Thanatos and Eros and like all these,
he puts the Thanatos back,
yeah, like this existential requirement of this death thing, right? And then like even libidinal energy, I love that. Whether it goes into Wilhelm Reich and talking about the embodied memory system, how the unconscious is the body, or otherwise, I think that there's a lot of really neat stuff there. And then of course you can see a lot of this cultural overlay, and and then we had all this beautiful stuff pre that time, even like mentalism and these different kinds of like hypnotic type concepts that use a lot of like alchemical concept and ways of defining the world, right? The world is mind, in using like the emerald tablet and these different theorems of like alchemical transformation, right? So yeah, I think it really set a really cool space and gave words and language to it to start playing around with it. And I love that people dissented explicitly. I think if anything, right, that is what mental health is about. Is like, you've created a construct, and I love that you've done that. Thank you so much for putting words out there. I disagree on some of these levels, and that's important, because if we all collude, we definitely uphold a delusion.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. And I mean, I think one of my things has always been like, I don't want to just get trained in any kind of therapy and then be the expert. I want to be in that kind of therapy as a patient before I do it with another patient, because there's the awe of learning, and then there's the aha of feeling. And I'm a huge advocate. I mean, sometimes people are kind of sheepish and they're like, well, I've come here for a while, and it's like, yeah, you don't need therapy anymore. You're fine. Like if you're unsettled with something, come back. But like, you should go try something else. You've probably heard my perspective. You've heard the way that I think, and like you've internalized what you need to internalize. You've filtered out what you don't, and like somebody else is going to tell you something different, and that is going to be useful too. So, I mean, Jungian analysis was a totally different experience for me than CBT. Was a totally different experience than kind of a more psychodynamic. But you learn that language, and it's why I can wear the hat now. If you just try and learn all of it intellectually, and then you're like, oh, I read all the books. That's why you like don't know how to apply it, and you end up just picking the one you like the most, and only doing that. It's because you haven't really been in it as a patient enough to know how to do it as a provider, I think.
I agree with that. I think I've struggled with that too, because again, there's this price wall that's constructed in order to access certain types of approaches, right? Like, unfortunately, if I label it with something, I can charge you another $50, right?
Yeah. And that's when you're saying that people are like coming up with these new models and then changing the name and not giving credit. Half the time, it's the person it's the institute's fault that is charging you $200 to have this on your website because we copyrighted a phrase.
Right. Well, and that makes sense. Yeah, having to create language in order to not be like copywritten.
I mean, there's some eye movement therapies that are combinations of ETT, NLP, and BSP that we worked on and we're kind of doing with other therapists, and we've tried on our spouses, and like it's interesting.
Yes.
But it's like, where do you go with that? If I call that ETT, I got to talk to Dr. Vasquez. If I call it brain spotting, I got to talk to. If I call it fusion, I got to talk to. But like, what do I want to do? I don't really want to be the guy going to conferences and being like, here's a new thing, for 10 years. I just don't want to. But like, or do you just make up a new thing and then have everybody be like, oh, so you just pulled this out of nowhere and it's not evidence based at all? Like, I don't know, and
I hear that. Yeah. Like, for instance, like we have sensory motor psychotherapy, we have Hakomi, we have all these really kind of nifty things, right? Where people are labeling their personal approach to and oftentimes rooted in a lot of these traditional things, right? So we have like vegetotherapy oriented Wilhelm, like Reichian stuff, like whether people want to buy into it or not, or like the outcome of Wilhelm Reich's life or any of those things, like you're probably deriving some of your breath methodology, your observational awareness and phenomenology from old school body armoring.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Through bioenergetics.
Well, Reich didn't do himself any favors either. I
No.
mean, he was trying to shoot down UFOs with
And
orgasm energy by the end of his life, and
dispersing like rain clouds and things. And that's, yeah.
well,
Who
and
knows?
the FBI took all the equipment too, which even for the time was kind of an overreaction. I mean, he really made some people mad, or maybe they just wanted all the orgasm energy for themselves. I don't know. I mean, what I think is funny too is like any psychotherapy lens, like what you're talking about, that kind of perspective. When you go so far into it and then you extrapolate it, it like becomes a cosmology. Like Jungian analysis is like, oh
It
wow,
has
there's
to be, though,
archetypes.
doesn't
So
it?
what does that mean? And but Wilhelm Reich, going nuts kind of was somebody making a Freudian metaphysics, like a classical Freudian metaphysics, and then being like, oh, okay, well, if sexuality is the energy under everything, maybe sexuality is also the energy of the cosmos, and atoms are respond to orgasms, or what, like.
And yeah, right. So this orgone energy, which is taken from the idea of the original libidinal energy. Libidinal energy is just life energy, which is sexual or otherwise. It's projection, whatever that is, but it lives, right?
Freud usually applied it in the realm of sex more than other
Yes.
places.
Yes,
Yeah.
he did. However, the neat thing though is, let's say, like, if we change our lens and we look at tantric traditions from Tibet or India, right? Now we have this idea of the interplay of this duality of relationship between energies of masculine and feminine, when they use sexual language to describe the fundamental workings between polarities, right? And so in the alchemical marriage, right? So this idea of creating a total self using this sort of language.
I was going to say the Rosicrucian chemical marriage, but I mean, even like just sex is kind of, a big force and part of our humanity, but it also is just a pretty obvious metaphor when you're making metaphors, even like, I mean, there's Psalms in the Bible that are talking about the love of God is the love, you loving God is the same as the love of man or woman, It's like, what does that meme that's out now where they're like, somebody invents like a clock and then they're like, oh, God is a watchmaker. And then somebody invents architecture and they're like, God is an architect. And then somebody invents an AI and they're like, oh, we're in a simulation. It's just like the easiest way,
That's true. It's not too far removed to
Yeah.
create a metaphor that incorporates that. I think, though, the nice thing, though, when we're starting, the neat thing about that is when we connected these qualities, like psychic qualities or libidinal qualities or whatever, to the body, what we can do at that point, though, is now we have some languaging to explore the phenomenology of my felt experience. Ooh, that's excitement. How does excitement work? Well, I experience it in this fashion, in this way. And then now we're like, oh, how does my body produce energy, which is felt?
Yeah.
We need to engage with this world. And then we have all the kind of ways that we create creative adaptation to all the things. And that's another thing that I really love from sort of this memory reconsolidation type stuff. Coherence therapy is this Bruce Ecker and Lauren
I'm
Holly's.
familiar. It's like somebody trying to make a solution-focused brief treatment of psychoanalysis, which is kind of interesting.
It's interesting because it's following the memory reconsolidation thing. So theoretically, right? And I've always loved this, and I don't. It always baffled me that a moment of explicit trauma can indelibly burn in a learned experience for life. If that's true, using kind of this polarities, duality process, it
lets you know the brain is thinking about it in a different way, and like a almost religious or spiritual way. Why other moments are not being re-experienced all the time, but traumatic moments are. So that's telling you that that's a different kind of memory.
Right. So this idea that it does this, but my wondering is this, right? And I've always wondered this from the very beginning of every time I, the first somatic oriented therapy, I think it was sensory. Anyway, Peter Levine, I was looking at Peter Levine's work and I was like, oh, this is curious. Is that like, if a memory.
Somatic experiencing? Is that what you're...
somatic experiencing. So if a memory can be created so powerfully in a moment, it should be able to be uncreated in a moment. Right.
You making contact with that somatic memory in a way that is not re-traumatizing.
And it always kind of like tickled my mind to think that, because if it can be created, it should be able to be uncreated in that kind of way. Now, we've talked about not wanting to re-traumatize people and kind of titrating those experiences, which I understand.
However, certain things you can't do. It's why you have to be able to take appropriate risks at a certain point, but there's not
Mhm.
always a way to eat some of those memories in this bite-sized way that some of the models are designed to do.
And I think you're right. In my experience working with people and in my own kind of self process as I go through that, right? Like there are some memories that must be experienced as a gestalt. Like the whole
Yeah.
fixed experience must be digested in the moment.
Well,
Not
brain
that it,
spotting does that,
yeah.
like if you have somebody who's pushing enough to take you all the way in. I mean, I've said, I'm kind of frustrated. Everyone that I've ever talked to that has had a bad experience with brain spotting, the provider didn't look at the people at all. They didn't really map the trauma at all. They were just like,
Mhm,
what do you feel here? 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 And the person was like, nothing, nothing. But like it pulls everything up at once, which is
mhm,
kind of spiritually profound and interesting to have this 2-3 day process where you're re-experiencing all these things,
mhm,
mastering them. And at the end, memory comes back or you kind of realize what it was you were processing, either
mhm.
yourself or working with a therapist. ETT, which is, a newer thing that
Yeah, using
is
the
trained
light.
to, yeah, like it can bring up incredibly specific parts
Mhm,
surgically, and I loved brain spotting. I still love it. So it's not like, but it's not appropriate for everything. I don't think any one thing is.
mhm.
And it's wild. Like with ETT, there was like one of the eye movements. We had the color and frequency, and the person said, "Can you do something with like acid reflux?" And I was like, well, I mean, that's not really how it works. But I got, what was supposed to be for kind of throat, lungs, breathing, like top, neck, that area, which
Mhm.
is kind of a blue-green color, a certain flicker rate, whatever. And she was looking at it and then immediately started remembering when she was eating as a kid and she
Yeah,
was shamed. And then her whole stomach kind of shutting down. And then this whole thing just came up. But it wasn't this whole memory about your whole relationship with this child, like everything. It was this incredible around that one somatic
very specific.
emotional thing in this specific way.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's speaking to this kind of memory reconsolidation thing. That's what that also looks like, right? It's like every single moment that has created a pattern, it has that creative adaptation started because of a reason, right? So it's like, and if we attend to that, whether again we're focusing on a feeling, whether we're looking at a space in a visual field, whether we're moving our eyes to inhibit our amygdalas, whether we're stomping our feet, whether we're dancing, whether we're doing like any of the modalities that exist that are human modalities of expression, right? Whatever we track and whatever we stay with, if we were to stay with it enough and give language to it, even if we were doing some like just fill in the blank sort of word association stuff, it is likely that all those roads would lead to a story, right?
Mhm.
And once the nice thing about knowing what the story
And
is
sometimes our body remembers it in a way that the front of our brain can't, which is where a bunch of those modalities get stuck. I mean, if you're drugged or pass out during an experience, it can be traumatizing, but the memory is not written right. It's like a corrupted file on the hard drive
yes,
where, you maybe all you're going to get is the body's response to it. And that's what you have to go through and process it. But you're never going to be able to do this stuff because you didn't see it, you didn't perceive it.
right. And I
Maybe if you're very young, the damage is written in a different way. Kids don't make narrative memory till kind of 3 or 4,
right.
and in a cognitive way.
Yeah, and I think, and what I like too is like the narrative that we experience doesn't have to be the experience itself, right?
Hmm.
So consciousness accessing something in a way that my total brain can experience, which involves language components often, right? Um, when I can conceptualize it, even if it's a theme, for instance, I have to not eat because I will be hurt. Now,
Mm.
that doesn't have to have an explicit memory, but that's a felt sense that I'm giving words to. And once I can hold that with the experience in my conscious awareness now, and then I create these moments that contradict those are the things that unlock those old patterns.
Mm.
Um, and you're right, we can do that without eliciting that cognitive piece. However, it seems, in my experience at least, that that part is very useful for having, I guess, a total gestalt, a whole story, right?
Yeah, yeah,
The narrative piece is a really lovely part of me understanding myself in the world. Whereas if I do a purely somatic exercise, let's say I do a holotropic breathing or I go through
mm,
like some psychedelic thing, that can be really awesome. However, without the right framing, I think those things can also be disempowering.
hmm,
We're attributing it to some other something
hmm,
instead of acknowledging that it's a us thing.
yeah. Well, but I think that like it's not that the narrative is unimportant when you don't remember the event or it's not, able to be perceived. It's that you don't have like an intellectual cognitive memory there. It becomes part of a bigger narrative, like
Yes.
a bigger story. And you're still linking it to that, but figuring out what happened or who or whatever. I mean, even if you do, knowing
Yeah.
oh, there's Colonel Mustard in the green room with the rope doesn't heal.
Right.
It's
No.
re-experiencing physically and then going through the crisis, having the crisis resolve, and then letting my heart and my body feel safety.
Uh,
That's the thing.
I love that. And I love that pattern. And I think that animals are such a brilliant exposition of that, right? Like we have these systems because they're designed to deal with the world. And when we get to a place of completion, like I'm activated, I activate my parasympathetic or my sympathetic responses, they engage, they discharge appropriately to create the safety that I need. And then I take in the environment of safety, which is a completely different thing. And then it allows my body to dissipate or discharge or complete that cycle.
Mhm.
And the huge part, and I think in most of the somatic type work is like it never gets finished, right? It's the unfinished business story, right? It's like I never got to feel like it worked, and I never got to feel that it's over, and I never get to feel safe. So my body's going to keep on generating
But
that
I don't
response.
want to admit that and accept that framing because I know that it's over.
Yeah.
I know that. So I
Yes.
shouldn't have to feel that is
Mhm.
the fight that you get into with the more kind of ST, sensory thinking type patient.
Mhm. And I think that's an interesting space because, and again, you have to move that into that feeling frame, right? It's like, okay, yes, you're right. It is absolutely over. And yet here you are, and your body is still exhibiting behaviors necessary for that condition to be met. so,
Mhm.
so how do we create an experience now where that can be done, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
uh, and yeah, and I think that's the art of therapy, right? And it's not yeah, it's a very curious thing.
Well, it sounds like you're doing amazing work in your practice and where you are. I mean, you have kind of longer term career plans, or what do you see yourself?
Um, I just love doing therapy and I love reading all these things and trying to make sense of it because I'm a human in the world trying to make sense of that. The thing that I would love to do at one point, which is something I deeply appreciate about what you're doing, and there's a lot of people doing this, is putting information out for people to have access to it without any paywalls or any kind of things like
Yeah.
that, right? I think giving people free access to information so that they can experiment with what works for them. So
Hmm.
if I were to create a fantastical future adventure for myself, right, um, it would be to continue to learn and use mediums
Hmm.
along the way, hopefully as I feel a little bit more like grounded and confident in my own process,
Hmm.
and just share those things with always with the condition of like, this could or could not be true.
Hmm.
Please experiment with it within the appropriate context, using the appropriate supports that you
Yeah.
need in order to achieve those outcomes, you know?
Hmm. Well, I think I'd really love, it would be something that would be down the road if I was doing it, but I'd love for like Taproot to be able to host like almost like a depth psychology library that's free.
Mm,
Because there's so much stuff that's out there in the common domain, or that professors are retiring or whatever, and they're just
mhm.
likely to be like, yeah, you can have all of my papers and make them available, and it's stuff that you can't even get through that journal was gone 12 years ago or whatever.
Right. Oh, yeah.
And even if you pay $600 a month, you still can't read it.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I'd love to put together something like that. Our website, our collective is just kind of, we're all trying to, we think we can build something that is better
Mhm.
together than we can individually, and you get the cost sharing and everything that goes with that. But yeah, if you're ever interested in working on something that if we could help, like if I can give you the access to the website to kind of host or build something on the back end, like I don't know, some kind of electronic thing, if that's ever anything that you're interested in doing.
Wow, awesome. Thank you so much for taking some time to kind of explore some concepts around the therapy. It's lovely to explore and have these conversations. And I think
Sure.
um, it helps kind of flesh out and build some deeper understanding for myself. So thank you very much for taking some time with me.
Yeah, I mean, and I've got, I got to pick my daughter up in just a minute, but or I've got 15, 20 minutes or so. I mean, what like is there anything else? Because I don't want to. You had reached out and I think initially with some questions or things you wanted to discuss, and I would like to get to all of that stuff. I don't
Sure.
know how much of that was included in what we already did.
Yeah, I think a fair bit was. If you're, yeah, so we have another about 15 minutes. Is that right?
Yeah.
So, so
And I can call, try and get in touch with you later this week. November's a lot. The past 3 months have been just like the most wild ever. I mean, but it's calming
yeah.
relatively down.
So some things that I wonder that I would like to bring up or explore if we with the time that we have left.
Sure.
So because I'm not officially trained in any of these things, and also there's these paywalls to get exposure and therapy through these things,
Yeah.
I usually wind up being the subject of my own experimentation, right? So I apply these things, the methods and concepts to myself as often as possible, right? Like whether it's using brain spotting, right? And I kind of like feeling that felt sense and associating with that, or it's Gestalt work or otherwise, right? So I definitely understand the value of having another person. I think that fundamentally
Well, you
changes.
can't always do it. You can't always afford it, or there's not
Right.
somebody local, or what. I mean, sometimes the self work is the only option for certain things.
Right. And yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. So one thing that I was wondering about, and I did some more research and things when I first saw brain spotting, I said, oh my goodness, this looks really interesting. I like this idea, right? And this is also before I ran into memory
It fuses
reconsolidation.
with any kind of therapy too. You know, even like cognitive behavioral people like it. I mean, there's somebody in the training. Usually, it's more kind of less cognitive providers, and somebody who was one of the trainers. And one of the things was like, I'm a cognitive therapy person that does brain spotting, and I was like, oh wow. And I was listening, and she was like, you know, brain spotting does the thing where cognitive therapy can actually work because the body calms down, and then they can learn all this stuff. You know, it's like, oh wow, that's a neat way to think about behavior. You know, but that's what my problem with behaviorism is, that they think you can change behavior by talking about it. You know, most times people know what they're supposed to do. They just
Right.
do that. You know,
Right. And that's that experimental needing to experience. That's the experiential therapies that were in the 1960s, 1970s when they were doing all this really good stuff. And then we get into these ethical quandaries that have created what we have today to some degree. But it is what it is. But I really deeply appreciate living now in that there's so much beautiful. There's like 1,000 waterfalls pouring into this current zeitgeist, right? This current like space. And if I want to, and I'm open to it, and I can check my prejudices against certain conceptualizations and methods, I can take in a lot of really beautiful stuff that's very transformative. So one thing, as I was doing these kind of experiments, right, kind of like playing with that up, down, using the Z, X, Y axes, different kind of like checking different points and like moving between different points. What I noticed,
I can't do brain spotting on myself at all. Like there's inside and outside window when you get training, and outside window is where the provider's just looking at the pupil, and inside window is when you're trying to see what the person feels.
Yeah.
And for me, like, so outside window is a lot more effective in my experience because a ton of my patients are so dissociated, they don't know what they feel anyway. So they're like, I don't notice anything there. And I'm like, no, just hang out a minute. You're going to feel it. But when I do brain spotting with my therapist, I'm just like, I don't know. I think I felt something here. And she's like, no, and then I'm gone, you know? So like sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. I'm particularly bad at it.
So I'm wondering in your processing. So when I did this thing and I'm kind of playing around with this, and as I'm holding this space, right, I'm kind of like noticing my natural responses, right? Maybe some swallowing, maybe some like rapid blinking, maybe the eyes start to, agitate. Maybe I start feeling kind of those little neurogenic tremors that we're getting from this body discharge stuff. And I love that. And it makes total sense from a biological standpoint, right? Everything starts with orienting, right? Period. Everything started with an orienting reflex. That's fun. That's just how it is, right? And so I find this place, I hold that in space, right? Holding that. And what I've noticed in my own process as I've been playing with that in certain cases, I'll start there with a feeling, right? There's a felt sense, I'm experiencing that, I'm with it. And then my mind will automatically start populating that with parts. So now what I've seen happens is here's my finger is there, I'm attending to this, and then my finger becomes a part, right? So now I'm noticing that there's me, a self, a part there. And then it has dialogue and concept that starts playing out in my mind. And then I'm playing out in my active other parts are starting to play out there. And if I hold that space, my processing, right, my primary modalities and otherwise, that's what they like to do. They create a dialogue-oriented story because I'm very auditory. And then they'll play that through to a sense of completion, however that story wants to kind of close itself up. I'm kind of curious, though, and that's what really drew me to this is like, what if we, because also the other piece is like, if you have your eyes closed and you do this as well, right, your eyes still move if your eyes are closed, because that's just what we do to access information. And the neurolinguistic program folks talk about this decades and decades and decades ago, right?
Yeah.
But I'm kind of curious, is that a
They didn't
normal?
have the neurology though. Like the problem is like they don't distinguish between prefrontal mid and subbrain, and so like
Mhm,
that's why it doesn't work. It's like the eye movement NLP stuff is neurologically very interesting, but your eye's going to drift there when you're really feeling. Like you could just look here and lie. So
mhm.
saying constructed memories here, audio memories there, like that's not
Right.
the best metaphor about how the brain works because it can do different things, you know.
Right. Yeah. The fixed location, I think, is interesting, but they using and discussing the visual field and how
Mm-hmm.
tracking side to side from different areas of
Yeah,
visual
yeah.
field, super fascinating, I think. I'm sort of wondering what's been your experience. You don't have to give any explicit information, but when you've worked with folks and you're doing this brain spotting type methodology,
Mm-hmm.
either fixed point or you're kind of like jumping between points or tracking between things or whatever. Um, Does it often have a narrative component? Like, do people often express to you that they're experiencing an internal story with parts? Do you, and there's a whole branch of
Parts-based
brainstorming.
therapy is like fuses so well with brain spotting, it's almost becoming part of the training. Like most of the trainers will train you in it. And I'm not certified in it. So I mean I've done phase 1 and 2 and then,
Right.
you know, or
Yeah, phase
consult
three.
with a lot of people that have done a lot of the different new ones because there's a lot of splinter ones now.
Yep.
Um, but it sounds like what you're asking is like, is there a pattern with eye movement from NLP IQs that is relevant with brain spotting? Or are you saying do people see a story when they hit the eye position?
I think if I were to distill that, it would be when people are holding an eye position, are they accessing a awareness and part, or is it a part and a part? Inevitably, is that a
Sometimes, like parts-based therapy can get you there, but when you're there with brain spotting, you're so deep in a lot of the time, you're losing time. Like you don't like I dissociated for like 20 minutes when I
Mhm.
did the training and I was expecting nothing because EMDR didn't do anything for me. I was like, well,
Right.
but I saw it work for some patients. So I was like, well, I'll take some of the things from this training. And it was during COVID, and we were on a screen, it wasn't even in person. I was like, how could my eye know how far the thing is away?
Mhm.
And I mean, I like felt like I just needed to move my head like I was in water, kind of.
Yeah.
And I was just silent. And if it takes me, and not everybody goes in that deeply with processing, but if you do,
Mhm.
um, like you usually lose time. Like, so the person thinks the session was 10 minutes and it really is. I'm like, it's at the end of the hour because it took
Mhm.
me 10 minutes to get them to go down. So when you're really deep in, it's more about the difference with like ETT and brain spotting and EMDR is like brain spotting, most of the processing is not in the room. You're like opening this box and throwing all this
Oh,
stuff from the subbrain up into the midbrain.
yeah.
But like the front of the brain, hypothetically, I mean, don't send me an email and say I can't prove that I can't.
Yeah, well,
But
they
like
don't have any.
you don't even know what you're thinking about for like 2 days. Like
Oh,
you don't know
interesting.
what it is, and you also don't really get to pick what you hit as much.
Right.
I like it because the processing is so much more predictable. Like with
Mhm.
EMDR, very few people do this, but it's still terrible when it happens and it's possible. With complex trauma, like sometimes somebody would come in to process like a car wreck and you do it and they feel great and then they're thanking you and whatever.
Yeah.
2 days later, totally decompensate. I just remembered this thing from when I was a kid. I'm totally shutting down, totally whatever.
Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna process that. And you know, dad did this thing. Okay.
Mhm.
And then decompensate again. Oh, but mom was watching. I thought she was my protector. Now I'm in and they can't work. And you know, like that decompensation just doesn't happen with brain spotting in that way. It's
Interesting.
not that there's no decompensation. I said it's so predictable that you can if you it either doesn't work, you didn't because it's like you can knock the ball over the hill and it's gonna roll down, or you can keep knocking the ball up the hill. If you didn't get it to pop, like if you didn't go all the way through it, just
Mhm.
nothing happens. They feel kind of weird, but you didn't open it. If you open it, then they go all the way through this thing for usually 2 3 days. You know,
Mhm.
if you're obsessive, if you're compulsively trying to figure out what it is, if you're smoking a lot of marijuana, if you're drinking a lot of alcohol, if you're doing anything obsessively, you're going to slow processing down, you
Mhm.
know, but it will still work. It's just don't do that because like it will make the bad part last longer. But like your dreams are very weird. Usually they're kind of like letting you know what you're chewing on. They're kind of archetypal. They're just weird. They're not normal dreams. A lot of times there's very photorealistic moments in it. You know, that
Yeah.
happened for me. It's happened for a lot of my patients. With ETT and brain spotting, or with ETT, the processing is like 5 6 hours
Mhm.
and it's very specific. You don't have that huge thing. Does that
Mhm.
kind of answer your question? So saying, is it activating a part or not? Like you can use parts work to be like, okay, like I'll use it to be like, all right, now map that defensive part of you. Like, what does your spine want to do? And the person's like, oh, and you're like, no, really listen, like you're feeling this, like they're big. Do you want to curl up into a ball? Well, I kind of want to bend. Okay. Are you wanting to curl up into a ball like you're protecting yourself? Or are you covering something up like you don't want to be seen? Do you want to be invisible? Do you want to just train spotting, like float back into the carpet and disappear in that way? Are you tense like you're bracing for impact, like you're going to be tackled? Like that's all interesting information, getting them to go into the experience that would be parts based and mapping this part and what it somatically is and what it ideologically, what does the world around you feel like? If you feel small, that means everything around you must be bigger. Do I look bigger? Do I look intimidating? You know, do you feel smaller than the room? Weight, do you feel lighter than the room, heavier than the room? You feel it could be green. You could feel green. It doesn't have to make sense. You could feel VCR static. You know, what is that? And that lets the eye open and you go in, you know. But when you're going in, you're never like, I'm fighting the inner critic. This is what I have to, like, it's a pretty deep brain thing. Like generally there's not much talking. And
yeah, I think that's useful to kind of hear. I think so in different forms of parts work, right? So, and this is kind of, it covers a lot of different ones. It's just a strategy. You're working with somebody and they're accessing this thing. You say, okay, yeah, cool. If this were to be in the room here, where would it be? Now, inherently, they do gaze spotting, right? So they will naturally do it. So the question I wonder, and this is a philosophical question, as it isn't, there's no neurobiology to define it, right? I wonder if whenever we do that, we are looking at something that's inside of us that we've projected. So if on a creative construct level, we are always looking at something, right? Because you can
so you're saying, is that how the brain works, or is that where you're looking to a specific experience?
Where I'm wondering if that's just a normal function of how the brain does this, right? So if I find a space, right, and we have the other examples working with kids, you put a little fluffy thing on top of it, or I mean, traditional sand tray therapy, right? They're eye gazing down and they're fixating on certain areas. These are just naturally occurring processes that are pre-existent because they're human, right? So you're working with somebody and then they'll naturally fixate on a specific location and then they'll just start. However,
and what is the 1,000-yard stare in PTSD? It's somebody looking at something that isn't there because their eyes going to this memory from past, you know. I mean, if I'm understanding your question, like, I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, what David Gran would say, the brain spotting guy, is that, like, you can't know anything about how the brain works, so that's making an assumption, and you can't do that. So just get out of the way and let the patient's experience take you somewhere, which is probably, you know, right. You know, as a researcher, in my experience, if you don't have some kind of conceptualization, at least for me, like of helping them understand what's happening, a lot of people aren't going to go anywhere. Like there's no buy-in. And so you can't really even get them to the place where they feel it and kind of understand that it's working. But I think, like, there are times where somebody specifically looked there during a traumatic event and that's, they remember their buddy got blown up or they remember whatever. But when they're looking at that spot, that memory, the visual tends to like come back in the room and they're like thinking about it. And then there's other things that I think are more about brain function. Like resource spots tend to be down here, you know, they tend to be lower. And you can, and there, I've heard people speculate about like, well, maybe that's where kids look under their desks to self-soothe or something like that. But for me, like, it's like going back. I mean, some of what we do now is like a fusion of the ETT, the brain spotting, and the NLP IQs that we've been looking at how that works. Because if I put the glasses on you and I cover up, you know, your right eye so that everything's going through the right side of the brain because the left eye is connecting to the right side of the brain. Why do 95% of people have a resource spot right here? That immediately, if you pull all the anxiety off and you kind of, it's not processing anything, it's not an activation spot, but they're processing it, they're feeling calmer, and then you go into processing, it works better, you know? Like, I don't think 98% of people saw something right here as a kid. I think that more is a brain function thing. So, I mean, that's, of course, incredibly speculative, but does that make sense? That I think it's both. But I think that the memories that are related to where you were looking during an event, and that was true for me too. I remember like looking at a spot and having memories come back from childhood and then being like, oh, brain spotting works. That's cool. When I was just reading the book and trying to do it to myself. And then that's like the least part of the process. Like that's not very deep in at all. That's not how the process works. Does that answer you? I feel like I'm talking a lot and I don't know if I'm answering what you're asking.
Yeah, no, I think that works. I think part of mine is speculative, right? And so I like how you kind of reiterated, like, we can't fundamentally know what the brain does. It is useful, though. And then it sounds like in your own research, what you're exploring is how the eyes, which are an external part of the brain, how they affect the way that the brain works and processes things. And sometimes it's almost as if there's just a mechanical framework that, if it's held, generates a certain kind of reflexive response.
Well, it's like if you are building a computer, I'm kind of dating myself, everything's system on a chip now, but like when you build a computer, the stuff that has to talk immediately has to be right next to each other. Like the CPU has RAM on the chip, and then the
Right.
RAM has to be right next to it, and the hard drive can be farther away because the latency is less.
Mhm.
And everything else is filtered through kind of like mid and front brain. That's a sense. Smell goes pretty deep into memory, but the visual optic nerve
Yeah.
runs directly
Right.
through to the brainstem, because you have to see something and jump when you're a lizard. I mean, that's the oldest part of the brain. Like, and you can't think about it. You don't need to pontificate, and like you just have to move. So
Right.
it's like with brain spotting, somebody's moving before they know why. I mean, for me, I felt like I was moving my back of my arm, but I wasn't choosing to. Like, I didn't know why that was happening, and it was confusing. And like, so now I'm kind of losing my train of thought of what we were talking about. But like anyway, I think vision and the pupil is giving you the best, fastest indicator of what's happening in a client's experience. You know,
Yeah.
even if they're not aware. Like with ETT, people dissociate on certain colors. When that
Mhm.
color goes black and they're like, they know it's yellow, but they can't see it,
Yeah.
that's immediately detecting dissociation. Whereas normally I'm having to look, or do you look spacey? What's your posture doing? Are you having trouble trying to train of thought? Oh, every time I bring up mom, this happens. It would take, multiple sessions to detect dissociation sometimes. ETT, immediately. There you go. Like with the pupil, you're able to see immediately what the brain is doing.
Right.
If parasympathetic is, active, or if sympathetic is active, when your pupil is just super wide under the same lighting for no reason, every time you're in one location, something's there.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's like one of the most observable, if you attend to it, right, it's very clear and very descriptive, versus a felt sense of a micro tremor in the iliopsoas of a human, right? Unless they have like a well-developed felt sense and ability to track that,
Yeah.
it's it's very hard to like touch into the body-oriented things up front like that. So I think, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think for myself, it's definitely one that I'm kind of curious in exploring a little bit more, the brain spotting generally. And then my own self, for my own benefit, there's theorizing about what that looks like, how that works, and how to engage that organically, right? I
It
know
sounds like you're asking how you would integrate brain spotting with the other things you're doing. Is that kind of what you mean?
I that's what I'm looking forward to as I kind of like create a more integrative sense of how the mechanics of everything works, because my favorite type of work, and I'll kind of like speak to that, is like I really love the inherent flow of how how we process and how we move and are as beings. So I like when things naturally fall into a method, right? It's like, oh, and now we're here and this eye is over here, now let's do this and these things. I really struggle to some degree applying top down, like directive approaches to other people, because my ultimate belief is about therapy generally, right? Is like, I don't want to have this. I would love for you to be able to learn how you work in such a way that you can make this happen on your own if needed, right?
You're wondering how to give people a lens to make this something that you could do individually?
Yeah, I think that that's
Yeah.
the ultimate thing, and whatever languaging that works with, or whatever preamble or psychoeducation, ultimately this is naturally you. You've been taught not to. How do I help or provide this service where you can learn to heal yourself in the way that you're designed to do that without all the cultural, inhibitions or requiring a therapist, even though I can definitely speak to and honor the fact that it can process much quicker and much more efficiently when we have that ventral vagal connection and sense of safety.
Well, I think that like there's a ton of people who have tried to write therapy as a book, write a modality into. There's a guy who did that with Adlerian therapy. It's something self. There's a guy that did that with IFS that brought a ton of people to IFS because it's basically how you do IFS to yourself. And those work for the people who they work for who needs that modality. But the benefit of having a therapist in the room with you is that I can switch between this. Like when I use the language of Jungian analysis, you might hear spiritual abuse or something scary to you. And I use this language, like, somebody is going to be very, like, for example, like a lot of people who are not typical therapy woo-woo people are going to be very attached to ego-focused language, right? And they're going to really want to concretely understand what's happening, and they're not going to want to lose their sense of self. And
Absolutely.
so when you start to explain the hero's journey as this process of like, actually, you're growing, like you're appealing to the way they think anyway to help them. And if you did that ego-focused language to somebody like me, I would feel like you didn't get me and weren't making room for my experience, right? And a book can't do that,
Right.
I mean, you could write 50 books and then do a personality test and then modularly have it whatever, but that's not a book, right? It's an electronic book at that point. I don't know, am I misunderstanding you, or is that what you're asking?
No, I think that it kind of hints at sort of what I'm speaking to. I don't know if a book would be the means of it. I think fundamentally, I believe that humans have the capability built in organismic self-regulation, right, to heal themselves. And I think that we have a lot of cultural constructs that we've designed to stop ourselves from using our organic processes.
Yeah, I mean, like a ritual or a activity, some kind of some process that would be self-led.
Right. And I think there's all sorts of things, and that's ultimately what these are designed to produce, right? They're designed to produce a means of accessing our natural way of doing that. And we do that in relationship, and I can like honor that and understand the like validity of connection on a very like healing level. And I think the other part, and this is like a personal challenge, is also like finding the not requiring or not being required to required to be educated in a way to use my own body and natural processes to be healing, right? Like I have to go through a process of relearning how organically my thing was.
One option would be to never forget, to change the way that we raise children, to realize that emotion is not, and we're not shaming the emotion, we're shaming the way that you're handling it, that you need to feel it, but you need to feel it and not let it control you, and we don't do that. So much of the time what they learn is that the feeling is bad and then they quit feeling.
Right. And I think that catches so much of it, because whether I'm staring into a certain location or I'm accessing a part, I think this idea of being able to feel well, not feel healthy, but to feel as a very concrete skill.
Feel whole.
To feel wholeness and all of that. I think that hopefully that's sort of where the pendulum swings, right? It's
but to feel whole is not to be perfect. And even if we say, oh, I know I'm not perfect, whatever, we don't know that, know. And that's all of therapy is kind of trying to come around that. So how do you, in a book or a ritual or a self-led process? I don't know. We've been working on it for a long time.
Right.
Yeah. I do think that you could probably train an AI to do fancier things with pupil movement, and we've working with a developer and some other things right now. The problem is that a lot of those companies are struggling to figure out how to get their stuff into the mental health space, and they don't want to talk to small people like me that you don't have a giant company and whatever.
Well, especially with
they're trying to program them to do CBT, basically, like the people that or self-led meditations and things, and which is fine. I mean, there's maybe a role for that, but I'm really wanting somebody. Microsoft says that the pupil sensor that they use to do the hologram is on the HoloLens is biometric information, so they won't give it to us. Apple, nobody will talk to you. We've kind of run models and played around with different things, but you kind of need a lot of money to.
Sure. To encourage technology to help elicit certain responses in human healing.
Yeah. But I mean, the pupil stuff, and there may be patterns that I can't detect, that a computer running a lot of trials could notice something that's more helpful than what we're doing, or notice subtlety that I can't.
Sure. Targeted lights of certain colors to certain locations on the retina and all that kind of cool stuff.
Yeah. A lot of one of the ETT modules with the goggles, uses light direction on the pupil, and like it doesn't, like usually there's not that much emotion, or the emotion is secondary. It's more physical. It's like it breaks these feedback loops in the way we experience pain. So you can like, and it functions sort of like a stellate ganglion block, in that like you're not changing the medical thing, but the way the person feels the pain becomes different, and the emotional assumption about it becomes different, and it's instant. So if anything in ETT gets validated soon, it'll probably be the goggles, because it's like the most objective thing. That, I mean, when I did it, my ear was bleeding, like my eardrum had ruptured, and I was like, guys, I didn't mom issues my way into this thing. It's not psychosomatic. And they were like, no, just look here, and like it worked. It wasn't in pain. I didn't take the steroid or anything, and like it was like, I don't know if it really, and they would click it back to the other one, and I would feel intense pain. So it's like something about, I don't know. And he took, basically thousands of articles about light direction, mostly seasonal affective disorder research, and then put them together to make the model. Most models come directly out of observation. I mean, even brain spotting did that. Somebody tried something and tried it, and then they thought it was neat, and then they kept trying it. ETT is different in that you could never notice any of those things in the room with the patient. He read thousands of research studies about how the brain works, and then tried to make a model from that. So it's this weird outlier in that way.
Yeah, and there's some really kind of cool recent evidence about memory reconsolidation stuff by using directed light. That's a cool thing.
Yeah. Well, it's been really nice having you on. I'm gonna, one second. So if anyone, I can point to your website, the Psychology Day page in the show notes.